Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Lung. I am part of the Belmont Forum Secretariat. The Belmont Forum is a international organization that funds research, transdisciplinary projects for global environmental change. We are here today because we're having a discussion with IASA to identify how do we create equitable partnerships, especially around the conversation of open science. And I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague, Monica Bauer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So my name is Monica Bauer, and I'm at IASA. We are a international research institute that advances systems analysis and applies its research methods to identify policy solutions to reduce human footprints, enhance the resilience of natural and social economic systems, and help achieve the sustainable development goals.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new participants who have joined in today. My name is Brian Lung. I am a member of the Belmont Forum Secretariat. And today we're going to talk about open science and some of the challenges that we face, especially when we want to build equitable partnerships and some of the challenges, for example, such as AI. I'm really excited that you're all here. Today we have an exciting lineup of panelists from around the world. So appreciating all of you attendees from joining from all around the world. So thank you. Good evening, good morning, or even good afternoon. We shall begin shortly with the purpose for the event. So I want to first ask the question to the audience and even to the panelists first to ask, how do you define open science? I'm going to open up a Zoom poll to see what you all think. Right now, you should see a window that pops up in the middle of your screen. What does open science mean to you? And there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer. This is more of what how people think of and perceive they view open science as. And for those who are just joining in and just coming in, my name is Brian Lung. I'm a member of the Belmont Forum Secretariat. And you are here today because we're talking about open sciences and how to build equitable partnerships. I'm joined here by my colleague, Monica Bauer. Passing the floor to you, if you want to give a quick, brief introduction.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We're looking forward to the discussion and seeing all of the comments that you're leaving in on our poll. Yeah, before we're getting started.
Yes. And because we have people with different accents here today, to make it easier for everyone to understand what we're saying, in the bottom of your Zoom window, you will see a white box that says CC, closed captions, show captions. Click on that and you'll be able to see the text on the screen as we talk, hopefully making it more easier to understand. And let's share the results. Wonderful. So most people, what we see is that most people define open access as primarily what open science is. But what's also very interesting is that people have a broad view of what open science really means. And I think it has to do with the history behind the whole, how we came to arrive at the definition for open science. And I think to begin, one of the current definitions that we have what's working and what we have going on right now is open science encompasses, let me show that. Okay, there we go. So open science encompasses the broad concept of dissemination of all components of scientific research. And when it means all components, there's multiple different types. There's methodology, for example, research or programmatic. There's also open source, open data, open access, which seems to be the largest group that's represented here, open resources, and open peer review. This is really interesting because in the era of the last, during the pandemic, all of these open abilities or open science platforms allowed us to really progress past it through the pandemic, especially open peer review, for example, and bioRxiv and all that, medRxiv. There's many initiatives related to open science. For example, there's some policy examples are the Bethesda Open Access Initiative, some initiatives that started in 2001, such as the Budapest Open Access Initiative and the Berlin Declaration on Open Science. These were one of the early starters of open science and defined the concept as mainly academic. Later on, there's been more definitions for open science. For example, the shift in changing of the definitions first started from the San Francisco Declaration on Research, also known as DORA. The most recent definition now comes from the UNESCO recommendation on open science that is been released and has been signed and adopted by, I think, by 193 countries. So this was published in 2022. And on that note, one of the questions that I have is, what's the progress and where we are and what's holding us back and how do we move forward?
And following up on those questions Brian's bringing up is also maybe why partnerships. So SDG 17 focuses on partnerships as action is required by all to achieve the SDGs and that no one is left behind. So we want to explore how important it is for these partnerships to also be equitable, especially in the context of open science. For us, we saw this dimension addressed in the 2022 UK Collaborative on Development Research Report on the 4 approaches to supporting equitable research partnerships. From the entire, the report is looking at supporting the research partnerships ecosystems, strengthening research relationships and research systems, budget for partnership building, and the implementation processes and procedure that sustain partnerships. So recommendations in these are coming for researchers, funders, and partners, so all of the stakeholders around. But the report doesn't explicitly define what is an equitable partnership.
And on that note, I think it's an interesting question, like how do we define equitable partnership and what it means? Before we can define that, I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we define equity? And so I think what at this moment now, I know that many of you are not able to see the chat, but we're going to play a little activity which I call a chat waterfall, a Zoom chat waterfall. So I don't know if people have heard of it, but if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat box. Click on the chat box and you'll be able to type to everyone in the meeting. What I would like you to do is answer, don't hit enter yet, right? So just in the chat box, everyone write down what equity means to you. So in the chat box, don't hit enter yet, just type in what equity means to you. We'll give it a few more moments. All right, 3, and we're going to enter in 3, 2, 1. Nice. I'm so glad that a lot of you participated in this activity. So as we all hit enter, we had this slew of comments on what equity means. I see some comments such as what everyone needs in their own terms, more support for those who need it. Science equity means that there's no there's no barriers, level and unequal playing field, same conditions, access for all based on their needs, global decolonization within global partnerships, space for all worlds. Wonderful. This is exactly what we're going for, and hopefully we can talk about these issues in today's session. At this moment, I'm going to close the chat so we can get back to the next discussion.
Okay, so if we're continuing on our conversation, so we're looking at the UNESCO recommendations on open science. And here UNESCO's definition highlights the important open engagement of societal actors, and it recognizes the role of all individuals, community, and it should not be restricted to scientists alone. Examples of these types of partnerships and collaborations would include crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, scientific volunteering, and citizen science. One goal is to increase the inclusivity of traditional marginalized scholars by building bridges. And in today's conversation, we heavily focus on identifying these challenges and opportunities through equitable partnerships so that we can achieve the goals listed in the UNESCO recommendations on open science.
So in other words, what I'm hearing here is open science is the goal as described by the UNESCO, right, in this recommendation reports. And it's equity, and science equity is the framework by which we could achieve open science. And so the UNESCO's definition highlights the engagement for more societal actors. And it also recognizes the role of more individuals and community members to participate. And it's not restricted to scientists alone. So that means that we have partnerships and collaborations such as more crowdfunding, more crowdsourcing, more scientific volunteering, and even citizen science. And since the goal is to increase inclusivity of traditional marginalized scholars, but we can do that by building bridges among them, between them, among them, creating more of these partnerships. And today's conversation will heavily focus on identifying these challenges, opportunities through equitable partnerships, so that we can achieve these goals listed in the UNESCO recommendation on open science. One challenge that we all foresee, or we foresee, is the rise of AI and machine learning. One opportunity that we also have here is to build equitable partnerships for open science for this discussion. Since AI is a reflection of our society, what inputs we are putting in will exacerbate it or make it worse. So the inequalities, the biases, the scientific prejudice that are out there, AI is going to learn from that and in a sense, learn from it, and even exacerbate those societal inequities. In the era of innovation, we know that AI will evolve quickly. For example, for the number of people that it took to adopt Twitter and Facebook, about 1 million of them took 3 to 4 years. Instagram, it took 1.5 years. And ChatGPT, it took 5 days. So the speed of innovation of AI is going to just rapidly increase it all around us. I think thinking about how to maintain and ensure those partnerships exist and last is really important. There are many challenges around AI, we know that. But for many, not only partnerships are not described in the Sustainable Development Goals number 17, which is really important, but we also need to consider, again, I'm emphasizing again, building equitable partnerships and how to deal with these challenges. And so by leaning heavily into partnerships, we have this opportunity today at this Sangha session to lean into building equitable partnerships, because it is probably one of the last things I can say that remains human on a human level. On that, we're going to switch over to our panelists and have them talk about what they're doing in open science and highlight their efforts. So first, what we're going to do is bring on from France, Alice Panier, head of the Geopolitics Technology Program at the French Institute of International Relations. Over to you.
Hi, Brian and Monica. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel. As my title suggests, I focus on geopolitics of technology, but not only on the dark side of things. I'm also looking at, cooperation on technological development. I'm currently finishing up a long paper on this dilemma between openness and closing, between open and close, if you like, in research collaboration in emerging technologies such as AI. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about that in the minutes to come.
Thanks, Alice. Next, we have on our list from Guatemala, we have Edwin Castellanos, Science Director for the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, also known as IAI. Edwin, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Good day to all. Very happy to be here in this panel. Like Brian said, I'm from Guatemala and I'm based in Guatemala as the Science Director for the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, which is an intergovernmental organization serving 19 member states of the Americas. As an institution, we pursue the principles of scientific excellence and integrity, international cooperation, science outreach, and capacity building. And we support the full and open exchange of scientific information relevant to global change to reach our vision of a sustainable continent and planet. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Edwin. Next on our panelists, we have from Japan, Miho Kame, policy researcher at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, also known as IGES. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for everyone. I'm very much honored to be here, and thank you for invitations. And I'm from the Integrated Sustainability Center of IGS in Japan. My research recently focusing on the development of socioeconomic scenario for specifically city scale tackling climate change and the climate resilience. So I think I'm really working with the local government to collaborating with developing the climate strategies based on the scenario analysis. So this is very open science, I think, for collaborating with all policymakers and stakeholders and citizens. And I'm also currently working on the UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook GO7 process in the chapter of drivers and pressures, focusing on component of technology and development. So we investigated all types of variation of technologies, how technology impacted on the human development through past and current and future projections. So I would like to focus on that kind of perspective today. Thank you.
Thank you, Miho. Next, we have from South Africa, Nakuthula Muchu. Because she's currently traveling today, I know that we're going to try to bring her on. And so she's not here, but when she does join, we will have her speak. She's the Deputy Director for the Open Science Platform for the National Research Foundation. So when she comes and is able to sign online, we will bring her on. But in the meantime, we will move over to our next panelist from the United States, Maxwell Henderson, Chief Data Officer and co-founder of Data Stream Insurance.
Yeah, no, it's great. Real privilege to be part of this panel and very excited to talk about this topic. I love the different viewpoints and diversity already of the group I think that'll be involved in this discussion, and definitely I feel a little bit the oddball in the room where I'm completely in the private sector here. So I have no real experience working with the government. My last 10 years, I have been working, applying and building companies around AI technologies for finance, for energy, for quantum computing applications, and currently for doing cyber insurance type methodologies. I think that particularly the time in the startup space does make you think a lot about open science, as often your resources are a little bit constrained. And so you definitely think about what's accessible and free very often. So anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Look forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Max. As we move, the next portion of our section, for those who are just joining in today, my name is Brian Lung. I am a secretary of the Belmont Forum. And we're here today to talk about how to build equitable partnerships for open science, and especially in the era where AI is large and booming. And so, the first, and some of the takeaways I want to get through to everyone here is that in our Q&A, we'll try to address 6 key messages or goals. The first is to recognize and addressing power imbalances in international collaborations for open science. The second is to promote knowledge sharing and capacity building initiatives to bridge the digital divide. The third is ensuring inclusivity and diversity in AI-driven research and development. The fourth is protecting intellectual property rights while fostering open and collaborative research environments. The fifth, developing ethical guidelines and standards for AI-enabled research to mitigate biases and potential harm. And lastly, we want to strengthen data governance frameworks to ensure responsible and equitable data sharing. These are the topics that we'll try to touch on today, and we'll hope that you'll be able to take away something for you down the road. Opening it up to our panelists, the first question that we have is, what are the challenges to open science in your country? And the first question I would like to ask is to Alice. What are the geopolitical challenges facing open science from your perspective?
Thanks, Brian. So I don't think I will answer only from a French point of view, because I'm looking at AI as a research field. So I'm looking not necessarily at the AI applications, but AI as a field of research, like or R&D field, where scientists are conducting either fundamental or applied research that will then turn into products, and that field is by definition a global scientific field. But so why does that relate to the open science question? I think it's because we all know that AI is a foundational technology that will have, or that already has, huge social and economic implications, and that it relies a lot on research, including on fundamental research for it to be developed, and we do need to compensate asymmetries that exist around the world in terms of research capacity to develop AI software, algorithms, applications, and we also need transparency in how the technology is being developed. Both for societal and political reasons, there is a desire to have transparency on how this technology is being developed. So there is a call for a degree of openness and a degree of partnership in AI development. A lot of it is government-led, and that's what I've focused mostly on, although I want to say a few words about the private sector then. But when we look at government, by definition, we look at potentially at conflict, at partnership agreements and their conditions, and we look at competition, including economic competition and tech competition, which is quite obviously at the forefront of international affairs today. And we do see that there is a context where we have some interruptions in terms of sharing research outputs, or in terms of even cooperating in research. We see that, for example, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been scientific sanctions that have interrupted international collaborations in AI research included. We see that in certain countries like China, we have domestic politics that push for closing off databases of research databases to foreign to access by foreign individuals, and we have more broadly research security concerns around the world where governments want to somehow preserve or protect their own research ecosystems in AI. So there is the tension between these geopolitical concerns and this context, and a desire by governments, including, I work mostly on Europe and a bit on North America, and there is a desire to have an open science policy, to have research diplomacy, scientific diplomacy. And you hear, Minister for Higher Education and Research in France using words like sharing knowledge is a central element of our diplomacy. We have a responsibility to share as much as possible with the rest of the world through scientific publication, open conferences, accessible databases, training courses for foreign students. But at the same time, you have the same governments that say that they also have an interest in, I quote, preventing companies' capital, expertise, and knowledge from fueling technological advances that will enhance the military and intelligence capacity of strategic rivals. So it's really about finding a balance between this desire to be open and inclusive at a global level through diplomacy, including through an open science diplomacy, and a desire to protect or prevent the wrong uses of something like AI, which is potentially a dual use technology. So I think to wrap, to go around that challenge, governments are trying to promote best practices in terms of whether it is data governance, AI governance, research integrity, and to promote things like multi-country dialogues around how the research is conducted, about what are the principles of open science, to try and create a level playing field, and so that there aren't some countries that will just close their own ecosystems to international collaboration, and others that will have this open approach that can be used, if you like, for the wrong purposes. I could go on that, and maybe we can go back to that too, in terms of like, how do you promote convergence on best practices? I just want to say that whatever I just said works for what is public research and government-funded research, but it doesn't include the private research, which in AI is growing in terms of the amounts that are being spent, including in fundamental AI research by the private sector, especially a small number of big companies that hire the majority of top AI researchers, and these companies don't have the same incentives for publishing their research, their data, their algorithms, as do academics. And so this creates a situation where we have little transparency about the state of the technology, how it is being developed, and we can't necessarily reproduce, researchers can't necessarily reproduce the research that is being conducted. And that also that it obviously also has a specific impact on lower income economies, where the public universities may not be as well funded as in the global north. So I'll stop here for now. Looking forward to hearing the colleagues.
That was a wonderful start. I love the dichotomy and the contrast you put between the private and the public, what the public is doing, and some of the opposition that is faced from the from the private sector, and what their incentives and what their goals are. And I like this tension. And I think the other part of it is thinking about what governments are doing, trying to make open science more, I guess, available, especially for lower and middle income countries. And we'll definitely reflect on that today. But I would love to have our panelists respond to that. But first, I'm going to go in order and have everyone give everyone a chance to speak, and then hopefully there's some back and forth among the panelists. Next, the next is for Edwin Castellanos. What are the challenges facing open science in low and middle income countries in the Latin America and the Caribbean region? And if you would also like to respond to what Alice talked about, that'd be great here too as well. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I would like to start by addressing the issue of access to the information, and that was the main issue presented by our listeners in the poll. And I believe that for sure that's a big obstacle for open science in low and middle income countries. The payment that you have to make to access scientific literature. Just last week, within our own organization, a colleague from Argentina was sharing a paper. Look, I'd like to read this paper in Science. Can anyone access it? Because she didn't have access. And among all of our colleagues within the organization, none of us could access the paper because most of us are based in the global south. So we had to reach out to a colleague in the north to get us a copy of the paper. So we definitely access to literature because of the barrier of payment is a difficulty. And this payment can be either a burden on the user of the information, but also on the producer of the information. As a scientist myself, I have always faced a challenge of trying to publish my research openly, but that means that I would have to have $2,000 or $3,000 in addition to the research money for the publication. and in our countries accessing money for research is so difficult that getting that extra $2,000 or $3,000 is definitely a strong barrier for publishing. But beyond the access, I would like to also stress the issue of language for sure. That is a strong limitation because many scientists and user knowledge and users of the knowledge in our region don't speak English. And like we see in this panel, English is the language, the common language for communication in the world. And so just by having this panel, for example, in English, we are limiting the access of, I would say, the majority of people in lower and middle income countries. So for sure, language is a strong barrier. And finally, I would like to stress other issues of equity in terms of, for example, the level of training or the level of proficiency that our scientists in our region have in terms of completing the process of publishing in scientific journals. In the global north, you see that there's a strong push for scientists in universities to publish. So they're basically training publishing from day one, once they start their graduate programs. In our universities, we have some of that, but not as strong. And so our own training in terms of completing the process of publishing is not as strong. And as a result, we oftentimes struggle in terms of just going through that process, in completing that process. And other things like, for example, limitations in terms of connectivity, that provides a strong limitation in terms of collaboration and sharing of information. Even nowadays, when we think that internet is so widespread, in many places, the connectivity or the access to internet is really still very limited. And we can see that whenever we have an activity like this, and we have people involved from countries with lower income economies, usually their connectivities are much weaker. Usually they have many more problems in terms of listening or even sharing their own information. So for sure, there are a lot of issues in terms of having the same base in terms of capacities and access to technology. So we do have an issue there of equity. And finally, it is important also to understand that when we talk about low and middle income countries, within those groups, we see a lot of difference. For example, in Latin America, most countries are considered middle income countries. But even within Latin America, we see huge differences in terms of capacities and access to information. Countries in the southern cone, for example, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, their science development is much higher than what we see in my region, Central America, for example. So even though we are all considered middle income countries, the science capacities and the access to information and the capacity to share knowledge is very, very different. So we have to understand that we see this wide range of capacities. And unfortunately, the lower you are within that range, the harder it is for you to really access and to really reach out to be a key player within this world network of knowledge information and knowledge production and information sharing. And so we really need to make an effort to look at those countries and groups in this lower end of this range, to make sure that we think in equity, and to make sure that we provide them with the right tools to become relevant actors. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwin, for that, capturing the differences in middle income countries, especially in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. And I like how you put it as like it's a spectrum. especially the scientific spectrum in terms of progress, in terms of accessibility. Everyone fits differently along that lines, and the needs are very different, and not everyone can receive or needs the same issues and need the same support. I love that conceptualization. Moving onward to the next panelist that we have today is Miho. One question that I have for you, if you'd love to respond to the issues that we mentioned previously, it's up to you. But the next question that I have for you is, what are some of the challenges to open science for researchers in the ASEAN region that you're aware of? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I answer from the perspective of Japan and Asian countries. This is specifically social structure, such as social hierarchical structures and inequality among and within the countries. Also, lack of effective governance system. That is a very fundamental problems for Asian countries, including our country, Japan. And this is not a kind of related to the issue of global north and global south. This is more depth context of history and culture, political system, and also kind of belief system. That is, many countries have different perspective of kind of historical belief system. It's still impacted on the human behavior. Also kind of bottom-up system of negotiation. So I think most of the government in Asian region become more like kind of open, quite flexible these days compared to the past decades. But I think people also understand we need more cooperation and among countries with within the countries. But I think still, I think that we lack of the good platforms to promote such knowledge sharings and also collaboration. And language, as Edwin said, the language is also the quite difficult barriers in Asian region. This is not kind of common language like English. It's many of the Asian countries, small children does not access to the quality of education. So many children cannot write and speak, can speak, but not write, read their own language. That is a quite a strong barriers to access to the education, and like this expands the global inequality and also digital divide in this area, in these eras. So I think bottom-up capacity have to be more encouraged and enhanced. And so fundamental social structure and customs should be more transformed. We need this transformation for overcoming many types of crises we're facing in this 21st century. But yeah, I think these are the very strong and fundamental challenges in our regions.
Thanks, Miho. I love how you were able to conceptualize the similarities in the Asian countries and the Latin American countries. Like language is one of them that you mentioned is a huge barrier. One thing that I thought was surprising, coming from living as an American, is the idea that belief system, and in terms of that cultural context, plays a huge barrier when engaging with the global society. It definitely does link up with the conversations that Alice talked about in geopolitics. The belief and cultural systems do collide. I see potential for a conversation there. Next, I want to just double check the participants to see whether or not we have Knox signing on. I don't see from Monica's expression. So we'll move on to the next panelist, Max. Your question is, what are the private sector challenges facing open science from your perspective?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. So I guess we haven't also talked maybe just a little bit on some of the, I guess just to balance this out a little bit, I think some of the positives in terms of open science from my perspective are there has been a lot of, in general, democratization of certain ways of learning and getting access to things for free that I think were much rarer to find a decade ago. I think GitHub has become prolific. You can often have a starting place for code that would be extremely difficult to write from scratch yourself and have multiple versions of it with simple Google searches. YouTube is probably one of the most efficient teaching tools globally. A lot of people with PhDs probably wouldn't admit it, but the first place they might go to learn something new is still via a YouTube video or again, checking the multitude of websites that have solutions to coding questions. So I think just the broad and massive content of essentially free learning materials, if you have an internet connection, is actually a really good thing for open science. It helps people in both the private and governmental sectors quite a bit. In terms of challenges, especially coming from the private space in the US for open science, I think this was mentioned by a few panelists, but possibly transparency is still one of the larger issues from my perspective. Science is supposed to be trying to chase truth, and oftentimes there's not a thorough vetting process of what is published. Therefore, there can be a lot of chasing ideas that can't necessarily be reproduced. And there also might not be appropriate documentation of how to even reproduce results that are published even by pretty reputable sources in the literature. So many studies have been conducted on this. There's I think this probably started a little bit more on the soft social sciences. Like there were large scale studies of psychological results, and the majority of them couldn't be replicated by, again, objective parties. A lot of that reckoning, I think, is still happening for brand new machine learning algorithms and approaches. And I see that as a challenge for the private industry space. If you're trying to take cutting edge technical approaches and you either can't get access to the data or the code to do those things, and it's not even a guarantee that they actually will perform if you spent the time and resources to build them yourselves. I think that's a critical challenge for open access. And I think we still lack some of the frameworks for ensuring reproducibility by some kind of third parties that would help make sure that some of the things that are really used both locally as well as globally are really vetted in a test, empirical way. And yeah, just to slightly also talk on a couple points, I think often we talk about the biggest challenge in the private world is, as you grow, communication is always the number one challenge. And I think that, we had really good points from I think all the panelists about this, but I think specifically even language and basic technology access is just some of the simplest things that could globally impact people. But still, even in the US, there's lots of asymmetries in wealth. So people growing, I live in Philadelphia. I love the city, but there's extremely disadvantaged communities in this city that don't have the same just basic technology rights and sometimes education and have the same issues with not being able to possibly read and write at the level that would let them even enjoy and learn more about something they might be really interested in the scientific world. So I think those are always going to be some of the central problems that will never go away and need aggressive solutions to make sure we're at least trying to solve them as best as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. One of the things I noticed was transparency is another issue that you highlighted. It was also an issue that was related to what Alice was talking about when she was talking about private sector transparency. And I guess and another thing that you mentioned that was also interesting for me that I didn't really think about was the span of the gap between those who are able to access and learn that about, let's say, access to GitHub and access to coding languages, right? Certain groups have the ability in the US to learn more about it than others. And you have this technical gap as well within a city, especially in this extremely disadvantaged communities. I guess one of the questions that I want to turn to thinking about it is, what are some of the opportunities? We talked a lot about barriers. I know you mentioned a little bit about how GitHub, how YouTube, and how Google has opened the learning process for everyone around the world. But one of the questions I had now is trying to think about the geopolitical end, trying to have a little conversation among the private sector and what private sector can do to overcome these challenges. What are some opportunities that we can take? So this is more of a question for either Alice or Max to take on.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in just to throw a quick one in. Yeah, I think I think what the private sector can do to help with open science in general. One thing, again, I sort of mentioned before is that in my opinion, there's just not enough effort put into, it's an incentives problem, I think, ultimately, a little bit, where private sectors are trying to make profit, and profit is not aligned for their company necessarily with open science. And so that's always going to create some challenges. It takes work, it takes resources to make science really digestible and reproducible and easy to use. And it takes, it also potentially is not just effort to release that for the private industry. There is sort of a there's sort of like a double whammy here where if you also are working on something proprietary, which could give competitors an advantage against your business by publicizing it and making it easier to understand and replicate, you're not only losing the money and time to make that science more open and better understood, you could also hurt your competitive advantage. So there is this, again, sometimes misalignment, I think, with incentives. Some industries, I think the private space have done a really good job of this because they're still very new. And so I think they're seen as a lot of green space. And right now it's kind of a rising tide lifts all boats. Particularly a good example for me is the quantum computing industry. I'm not sure how aware everyone on the panel is about this, but it's a very new technology. It's like a brand new type of computing architecture. It's nowhere near practical applicability yet for real world problems, but that space has seen a massive amount of open science publication. And I think part of that is because right now there's a sort of, this helps those competitors as well. If there is a new big upgrade for how to fabricate chip technology or a better quantum computing algorithm for solving finance problems, that can sort of solve a lot of people's problems. And there's not a huge, and this is still a small but growing space. So I think that particular world, it's very academic and it's very helpful for some of those small industries to publish things because it helps kind of everybody. On the flip side, I work now in the cyberspace, and I think one of the critiques you could make around cyber risk, and papers have been written on this, is that there's very little published about real world data. Like, people really keep that tight to the chest, and that makes it really hard to just jump in and try to, if you were very passionate about building models to stop people from trying to scam your grandparents, there's not great data sets just anywhere about those types of things on the planet probably right now. And so, and there's reasons for that. Some of those data sets, again, are very proprietary in the eyes of those people, and they don't want to give up competitive advantage. And they probably don't even want to publish some of the methodologies they use because, again, that could be seen as cumbersome. So I think if there were ways to, almost like what we saw with COVID, somehow incentivize pharma companies to develop vaccines and have a government incentive for the companies to do something good, I think there needs to be more incentives for the private space to commit more to open science, because right now, again, sometimes it's actually potentially in their negative interests to make some of what they do more open.
Yeah, go for it, Alice.
Yeah, just reacting to what Max was saying, I really very much agree. I think open means specific things in the private sector domain. It's sometimes also even just almost a marketing tool to say that you're open. Like even OpenAI, which has a 100% proprietary technology, calls itself OpenAI, and it's not, like, the system is not open. But regarding openness, if we think open source, for example, then even like the big tech companies don't have all the same strategy vis-a-vis open source. Some of them will choose to not at all open source their programs. Some will, but they will probably open source the programs that at a stage where it's more strategic for them to open than to remain closed. That is to say, it's the same with publications. I think companies will publish their research when only after the technology has been mastered and protected by patents and the like. And so so it's still useful for the community, better than nothing, to have probably an open source program or a paper that comes 1 year later than none at all. But it means it's not it's not always it's not just for the sake of sharing the knowledge. There is always like a rationale behind that is a bit different. And regarding the sort of the making up for inequalities in terms of access to either data or computing power or data storage, I think it's worth mentioning some initiatives that exist through governments, and I'm pretty sure through companies as well. I'm not sure if they have any programs for, I don't know, lending cloud computing power to researchers in the global south, but that could be like a good strategy as well for those actors. But I know that governments in Europe do have these kind of initiatives, probably in other countries as well, but I'm just not aware. There is in France, starting 1 year ago, the Recherche Data Gov, so that's Research Data Gov, like a website, and that is a repository for research data that researchers can access, and I think it's accessible from anywhere in the world. And there is also at the European level the Open Science Cloud, which is a cloud computing service but this one is only for European researchers or researchers in EU associated countries, so countries associated with the EU research program Horizon. So so I think it's something I forgot to mention earlier is access to research infrastructure and especially computing power, and obviously data, but also computing power when we think AI and the need to train the programs. Also, in terms of what the countries can do, I think promoting open source also as an approach is something that the EU is trying to do, promoting the digital commons, that is to say, those sources of knowledge such as Wikipedia that are part of the common pool, so to speak, and that have to be preserved. Or you were mentioning earlier YouTube and GitHub. I think obviously YouTube is, I mean, they're free, but they're not so free, right? Behind GitHub are people who maintain the open source programs or share the codes and maintain them. And behind YouTube is your own personal data through advertising. So it's not necessarily the same types of contribution to the common pool of knowledge. But it's true that they are free to use in a way, and that's they form a diversity of knowledge pools that everyone can draw from. Yeah, I probably had another idea, but I forgot for now.
That's all good. That's a lot of points that you made there, and a lot of initiatives that both France and the EU is working on. I just want to briefly give both Edwin and Miho a chance to respond to some of their observations on the private sector and maybe with the government in terms of transparency or even their views, what they've observed in their line of work. Over to one of you two.
Yeah, if I may react quickly to something that Max mentioned that caught my attention. And you at some point you said that, of course, we are generating knowledge and doing science to solve people's problems. And then I started to think, well, what problems do we solve? And I think that like individuals in like countries, we usually focus on our own problems first before helping others solve their problems. And so when we think about what problems we are solving, because most science and knowledge is being done within the global north, then of course the focus is on the problems faced by those societies. And public health and vaccines are a very good example. No, COVID was an illness that was affecting pretty much everybody, regardless of their income. And so there was a very strong global effort to develop the vaccine and the solutions. But other illnesses like malaria, for example, which is mainly focused in the global south, have been around and will be around for a long time before enough science and research is put into the solution. And the same situation can be said about other issues. And even in climate change, which is my own area of research, I have always said that it is unfortunate, but I think that we will not get more attention to solving that problem until the global north starts feeling the strong hit of that situation. And unfortunately, we are seeing that now in the very recent years. Now we are seeing the floodings and the landslides and the fires also happening in the global north. A decade ago, that was mainly concentrated in the global south. And so now that it has become a global problem, truly, hopefully we will see some reaction to that situation. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will add a little bit about the private sector and the transparency issues in Japan. So private sector is kind of, I'm working on the climate change issues. In terms of reducing the emissions, industry sector is really important sectors, and we have to investigate. Also, the emission from industry is very different from each sector, each companies, and each types of different industries. But I think the data for industry is very sensitive, so it's very difficult to get the latest monitoring data from industrial sectors. So it's also perspective vision really wanted to make together, but that is also the quite barrier to collaborate with kind of research institute to make more efforts with the private sectors for specifically the industrial sectors. So I think that is quite strong barriers. Also in Asian regions or specifically developing kind of global south regions, there is a serious problem of the monitoring data. There is not very fundamental structure of monitoring methodologies. And also initial investment is not sufficient enough. So they are not very hiding the data. They don't have the data. So it's really difficult to communicate with how we can collaborate and cooperate through the climate actions, because lack of the data, and we cannot investigate current situation. We cannot make the scenario based on the current investigation and monitoring. So that is a quite fundamental, serious problem. But I think quite lack of the investment, also human resources for developing the quite big types of monitoring data source is very currently quite challenging.
Thanks for those responses. I do want to shift gears and talk about something that was briefly mentioned by Miho earlier. You talked about the cultural context, and I think that was a huge barrier in terms of open science, especially when interacting and working globally. And that made me reflect on the other sectors and other regions of the world. For example, in Latin America, does cultural issues also pose a barrier as well? Even in the private sector, cultural barriers around the world, maybe, and also in Europe, the cultural barriers. Are there any? Just opening it up to one of the three of you, Edwin, Alice, or Max, if you want to take the mic.
Yeah, if I may, when I hear about cultural differences, I immediately think of a very strong situation that we see worldwide, but very prominent here in Latin America. The difference between the culture, we could call it the Western culture, and the culture from indigenous groups. And so over there we have a really strong divide in many aspects, not only the way we see the world, but also in the way we generate knowledge and in the way we transmit knowledge. And so there has been a lot of effort now to try to integrate indigenous knowledge to issues like climate change that I was mentioning before. But that is, of course, a huge challenge, because our knowledge system is based on writing, on publishing, in internet. But in many of these indigenous cultures, the main way of transmitting knowledge is orally. And so how do you compare two systems that are so different, not only in their vision of the world, but also in the way that knowledge is produced and transmitted? So that's a huge challenge. And in many regions in Latin America and in the world, indigenous populations are not a minority like it so happens in the global north. No, in my own country, Guatemala, more than half of the population identifies themselves as indigenous, even though they are considered a minority because their access to resources is still very limited. And so we still have there a strong situation of equity and justice, in part derived from historical situations of colonialism. And so we definitely have a strong barrier there, which is culturally, but beyond culture, no, is really more in the way that different groups of within countries, in this case, indigenous groups, are organized in different ways in which they envision the world and the universe.
I love that perspective. I love how you put the idea in terms of the culture in which they generate knowledge and share the knowledge is very different than the Western style, which is based on writing and internets. Over to Max and Alice, if you have any immediate thoughts.
Yeah, no, I guess I think that Edwin had sort of touched on a couple of these things. I think one of the maybe challenges that I would see culturally that impacts at least the United States is kind of a relentless push for publications through research. Like I think a lot of professors to get tenure have it's more of a numbers game almost. It feels like a little bit, I think, for some people. And I think that's where then you must be losing sight of a more primary goal, which is to try to do the best possible science, getting to the most interesting applications for the world. And I think a similar thing, I'm sure, again, is within the private space. The US in particular has probably similar to other parts of the globe, had a big cutback from grants that would do maybe more pure science research that could also sort of shoot for bigger, loftier aims. And I think the world has changed. So even getting grants has gotten quite a lot more competitive. And often the grants are awarded to more incremental progress that have a clear kind of monetary benefit. So I think some of those cultural things, I imagine, are things that can impede open science here. And I think like one of the other points made, I'm showing my cultural bias in that I'm a male in the United States. So I've read a lot of David Foster Wallace, who's a fairly popular author here, but he gave a commencement speech where he used this analogy about an old fish talking to two young fish in the ocean, and the old fish swims by and says, "Hey, how's the water today?" And the two young fish then say, like, "What the heck is water?" And kind of, again, just like getting across that idea that you get caught up in the culture you're in all the time, and you don't even question some of the underlying assumptions. Things like maybe there are great ideas for problems I'm trying to solve being investigated in other countries, but they can't access my ideas because of language. And I'm also not looking for theirs because of those blockers. And similarly, like I thought it was a good point. There's a natural bias probably for us being as open as we can, being that we are really focusing on, local problems, like the things that, again, the US or the global North or Europe is really caring about, where if I think there were a broader, again, information sharing sort of world, again, I think, you could use capitalism even for what it's good at, I guess, in competition. Like I think if some US companies were aware of problems in other parts of the world, they could help solve with things that they've already been researching and technologies that have been building. That I'm sure is places where there could be interest, but my guess is like a lot of time there's not even an awareness. And again, you just have a bias for what's local and people in your peer net groups, what they're kind of concentrating on and thinking about. So I think those are some of the challenges from the US in the private space in particular, possibly.
Over to Alice or Miho, if you ever want to have any
Yeah,
thoughts?
thanks. I'll jump on this. So in Europe, you have the EU level policy with regards to higher education and research, and then you have the state level policies, and the two sort of complement each other, and the EU can act where member states themselves are not acting and vice versa. This is one of those shared competences field. And so you have what the EU does, for example, with its Horizon program, where there is a lot of it's a huge amount of money that's spent on research, collaborative research, whether it involves only EU-based individuals and entities or international consortia. And there is this requirement, I think not always, but often, to share the results of the research that was conducted with these grants. And so there is this openness by default, if you like, position. But that may not be the case in the policies of individual member states when they provide research grants. They may have very diverse sets of policies. And I was mentioning France because it's one of those countries that promotes open science probably more than most other EU member states, although I'm not aware of the policies of all of them. But so you have this diversity within the EU in terms of the policies. Just a side note on what we mean by cultural barriers to open science and things that were mentioned earlier about language. It was said, and I totally understand why, and it's entirely true, that English is not necessarily a language that's accessible to all around the globe, and including in France, of course. But at the same time, for example, within the academia in France, at least in the social and human sciences, people are encouraged to publish in French journals, in French language journals, rather than in English, because of so as not necessarily to have this uniformity in terms of these Anglo-Saxon journals. But at the same time, that means that if a French academic publishes in a French journal in the French language, that research will not be available for people who don't speak French, which are probably more numerous than people who don't speak English. So this multilingualism can go both ways. But one thing I wanted to say about policies in terms of open science is that it's probably, so there is a lot of initiatives, and it's more like this openness by default at the EU level, and then diversity among EU member states. But I think one common thread is that it's probably not so high on the political agenda. And so it's competing with other priorities, and mostly priorities like being competitive, being sovereign in terms of technologies. And so that goes back to what I was saying earlier about this dilemma. And I guess for example, technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty policy goal is probably definitely first, and then open science second. Yeah.
I love the connection among all of you all. Miho, if you want to have the last closing thoughts.
Yeah, related cultural and the digital opportunities. I think Asian country, we have many of indigenous community in many mountainous countries, which are quite affected actually the climate change, like glacier melting, and many of the natural disasters quite recently increasing. But I think digitalization is actually one of the new opportunity for kind of new development patterns, because we don't need to make kind of quite heavy infrastructure we have, and the digitalization have give people more access for all, and quite light access, and you just need quite small in technology to access to the market and communities and your families and business for global market. So that is a new opportunities, but the indigenous community has their own kind of beliefs. For example, I'm working with Bhutan peoples, and Bhutan is quite a Buddhist country. So while actually the new digitalization and the new iPhone, people have quite iPhone, everyone. So they access to quite global market through quite small technology recently that is quite advanced. They open the window quite much, but still they are kind of having the Buddhism mentality. So, and Bhutan does not have the traffic signal now. So still people are making the signal by themselves. So that is quite a mentality. This is kind of a new opportunity. How Bhutan has made their own very unique development patterns by own, protecting their own knowledge and indigenous local knowledge and, like natural resources and their cultural resources. They are already aware of quite this is a very valuable, important things. But at the same time, they are facing very much serious climate change. They have to adapt this very serious disasters. So this needs the adaptation. Maybe digitalization and new technology support these strategies. But I think so this balance is very challenging, but also the opportunity to make very innovative and unique approaches.
Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions around open science. We're now looking forward to kind of taking the conversations, and we want to foster a collective understanding of the barriers and opportunities in building equitable partnerships around open science. And we'll have the theme of these questions now focusing on how have you benefited from your networks to achieve open science? And we'll go through a similar fashion as in the round with Brian, with individual questions for each of you. And we'll start again with Alice, if that's fine. And we're interested in looking at the geopolitical challenges in your line of work and your experiences there.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Maybe either throw the question at another one, and I'll see how I can then add up. Sorry.
Okay. No, sounds good. Then, Edmund, we're wondering, for example, what does IAI do to build equitable partnerships in the space around open science?
Yes, thank you, Monica. I will start by sharing my own personal experience as a scientist coming from a region where science is not really well developed. I am here representing an organization that integrates countries as diverse as the United States, Canada in the north, Guatemala or Cuba in the Middle America, and in the south, countries as diverse as Paraguay or Brazil. And so I don't know if you may wonder how come such a big organization representing the entire continent has a science director coming from Guatemala, which is a country that really doesn't have much science development. And the answer is that in my early career, I was really benefited from the work from the IAI. So in a way, I can say that I'm a success story from the networking that IAI promotes. IAI promotes research which is transnational. So every research project that we fund has to have at least 3 countries. The more countries, the better collaborating. And so this situation forces researchers to start looking for possible partners in other countries. And in a diverse setting like we have in the continent, in America, that is going to force people to look into countries where you usually don't look for or collaborate. And so as a young researcher, I was a recipient of support from the IAI, and I was able to get involved with researchers from the United States, from Mexico, from other countries. And so that already created a network for me that was extremely useful, not only in terms of knowledge sharing, but also in terms of learning from their own experience. I was commenting before, and it was also commented by Max, I think, that in the United States, for example, publishing is like the key part of being a scientist, whereas in my country it's not. So I don't have as much training in publishing, but being partnered with somebody from the US, that is like a mentorship situation in which I can learn from them. So in general, this transnational research that we promote is really a good way to create these partnerships among scientists and countries with different levels of science development. And then the other point that we stress a lot within the IAI is transdisciplinarity. So not only this collaboration among countries, but also collaboration among scientists from different disciplines, social and natural scientists, but also scientists with other stakeholders, especially in the last years, transdisciplinarity has become a key concept in our work, making sure that scientists approach other stakeholders outside the science world to make sure that the science is designed in such a way that the problems are not only defined by scientists, but defined by the people who are suffering those problems, either people on the ground like farmers or people in government who need to answer the political issues. So transdisciplinary also very important. And finally, I will speak about capacity building because it was also mentioned before, we need to make sure that science is digestible. No, we need to make sure that scientific knowledge is not only produced to stay within the scientific community. So even though scientists, we as scientists are trained to publish in scientific journals and to share our knowledge with other scientists, we really need to be trained also to share our knowledge with other stakeholders. Because at the end, if we want the science to be useful, we need to have that knowledge being produced in such a way that non-scientists can also understand and use that knowledge. And so capacity building on both sides, on the side of scientists, training them to share their knowledge, not only to the scientific community, but also to a broader community. And also training to end users of the knowledge, to people in government, for example. That's our main focus because we are an intergovernmental organization, making sure that people in government also understand that there is science, there is a scientist there who can provide useful knowledge. And this may sound trivial to countries in Europe or the US, where the figure of a science advisor is usual, is normal in a government situation. But in many countries in Latin America, for example, governments don't really rely on science to make their own decisions. The figure of science advisor doesn't even exist. So making sure that these governments consider this idea of science being the provider of useful knowledge for problem solving is also important. So capacity building in the way that scientists and policymakers can interact better and can have a useful conversation is a key point of our work. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Edwin, for sharing those points. And I think themes that go through that, or that words that came to mind while you were speaking is, for example, trust, to build those relationships with stakeholders or other researchers. And then another way, perhaps bringing up language that was brought up before, when you're bringing in these different stakeholders, the language used to connect them. So making science digestible, but also, that reaches the policymakers or the others in society who you want to bring in to have the impacts. Oh, it's I think important parts. Thanks a lot. Over now to Miho. We're wondering, as a researcher, what observations have you found in the Asia region and in your work to develop equitable partnerships? And if you have examples for us from your work.
Yeah, so I recently worked with Da Nang City in Vietnam for developing climate change actions. And this was really, I think, great experience for us, actually, to collaborate with really variety of many of different people in Vietnam, also inviting many of different types of researchers from Global Institute, not only from Japan. We invited the researcher from US, Italy, also Singapore, so Mexico. So many of different fields and different countries, researchers, and also collaborating with the all related the departments, which has it's quite difficult to collaborate through this collaboration in Japan, because we are always collaborating with only one single department which is in charge of the climate change in Japan context. But in Vietnam, we learned quite much through the governance system is quite different, because we could invite all types of departments who are in charge of the transport and buildings and infrastructures. And so one single focal point we found and we could collaborate with, then they can invite all the department related. It's like we invite 70 stakeholders at once. And this is a very formal process and kind of very politics. And yeah, so, but I think this was quite efficient, and the very much kind of the ecosystem of developing the climate action for kind of, like through the all stakeholders and engagement of the citizens. And yeah, so this collaboration is very kind of the, like new knowledge for everyone, not only the stakeholders and counterparts. We learn quite much, and also all collaboration of global institute, global partners quite learn a lot each other. I think culturally differences and data management, these backgrounds is quite different. And so I think this exchange of experiences in each country, we invite all members from globe, and also working with all stakeholders in each person, each countries and each cities. That is really, very useful and kind of very valuable for everyone. So that is kind of part of the open science for me.
Thanks, Mihu, for sharing that. And also I found a lot of it from the beginning of how projects are coming to be. And that's, I think, if we want to make things open science. And what some of the points that were brought up earlier in publishing, or what we're doing with these results and making them transparent, one has to already think about in that space when you're bringing in together 70 people from different countries and cultures, right? And it's very impressive, because I don't think those conversations are easy to hold space for. So thank you very much. And then moving on to Max, we're interested from a business model standpoint. We see how open science and profit margins in direct opposition with one another. And how do you see this development to create equitable partnerships?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it kind of is similar to some of the points I was talking to earlier, where I think that is in some sense true, where companies' incentives, again, are not aligned and sometimes can be in opposition of open science, unfortunately. I think that like we talked about, there are some things to try to improve the state of how that looks. I think, again, one option is trying to find programs that incentivize things for private industries to actually still have profitable, revenue generating goals that are directly aligned with things that do help open science. I had not heard that idea about, for instance, offering cloud compute resources to parts of the globe that might not have those resources as much, but ideas like that I think are really interesting. I have not thought as much about specific open science solutions like that. I'm sure more people on this call have given more thought, so I won't spend too long trying to come up with some genius idea there. But I think trying to find like explicit incentives around ways for the private industry to actually want to disseminate that information would be key and critical. I think on the other side of it, more what I've thought about rather than the carrot is probably the stick side of it as well. I think we haven't talked about that quite as much, but we are a US based company, and GDPR, for instance, doesn't apply to the US directly, but I can say from the private sector point of view, like what is happening in the EU from crackdowns on holding certain types of private data and obtaining more privacy rights is something now that everyone's talking about and is wanting to be prepared for. I think that if governments can figure out ways of passing legislation, which could, in some sense, again, form a kind of framework that has requirements around institutions that are doing technology and research for having like, what is sort of your duty to the country that you're in terms of like open science requirements. I think that if you're not meeting those, there being a penalty could be also kind of interesting. I don't think it has to be purely incentives. It could also be, again, there will be fines if you obtain someone's private information without their consent. There could be penalties as well on essentially hoarding certain types of data or restricting access for public information about at least general algorithm descriptions, things like that. There are probably opportunities there for increasing that. In terms of like building up the collaborations as well, I think that the first thing that came to my mind is, just better networking and conference type structures. I know often in the spaces that I've been in, conferences are pretty industry specific. So there would be amazing quantum computing conferences that would connect lots of different thinkers from hardware to software to algorithms to error connection. You wouldn't typically see all those people maybe on your day-to-day, but you could walk away from one of those events feeling really connected and having lots of great ideas coming out of it. Same thing for AI-based conferences and cyber risk conferences, insurance conferences. But I don't know how much of, again, a focus there's been on private companies wanting to get involved with open science type conferencing events and networking events, because again, there's an incentive problem. But I think that like, there's just obviously an issue here when you see Senate commissions and people kind of asking basic questions about how the internet works. Like obviously, like not everyone is on an equal playing field for understanding kind of what's going on technologically or who's doing what. And I think that, again, the US can sometimes be extremely US centric. So I would say, if anything, we're probably one of the most focused on our own problems countries there are. I think like just connecting more globally from the private space, at least having opportunities where it would actually be seen as like a good business expenditure. Like there's ideas here and connections that would be beneficial to us and in what we're trying to build would be really good. And I don't know if those conversations are really happening right now.
Yeah, I love that concept of digital literacy and even that concept of even open science and platforms and that literacy behind it, because I think just relinking it to the previous conversation we had about open science, right? We had issues on just the cultural barriers, we had issues on low and middle income countries and that spectrum of understanding and needs. I think one of the main primary issues is related to literacy. Not just speaking in the language, but in this open science space, these platforms, digital literacy is a problem. And how do you even make those incentives if the people don't understand the consequences of said technology, of said platform? And this is more of a question, opening it up to the broader panel, if you have any comments and reflections on it. And one quick note for the people in the audience, if you have any questions, it's almost approaching soon to our Q&A section with the audience. We have a Q&A function or a chat function. If you want to drop your question in there, we'll look at it and address it after this back and forth. Over to the panelists, if you have anyone wants to speak on literacy, digital literacy, and all that.
I can just briefly mention that, yes, for sure, capacity building, it's at the center of making some tools like artificial intelligence more accessible and in working in the lines of equity for all. We definitely need to have stronger capacities in researchers in developing countries in terms of what's happening in the artificial intelligence world. We need to have more awareness within governments in our region to have the minimum legislation issues around the situation. And we need to have the public better informed in terms of what these technologies can do to help you or to go against your own interests. So in general, for sure, making sure that all different groups of society are very informed of the benefits and drawbacks of these technologies are at the center of making sure that the technologies are used in the proper way for the benefit of the majority.
Okay, thanks everyone. And I just wanted to circle back and see if anybody had reflections, or Alice, if you'd also like to add in any comments.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to mention, because we were talking earlier about like examples of initiatives in partnerships for open science, and I don't know to what extent that fits because it's still early stages, but that's an AI-focused partnership that the EU and the European Union and the US have announced earlier this year that they want to build collaboration in advanced AI research, focusing on areas such as climate forecasting, health, energy grid optimization, agriculture optimization. So AI research focused on those areas that they consider are like for the public good, and they commit to share the findings and resources with other international partners, including low and middle income countries, to foster broad societal benefits of that cooperation. So we'll see how that comes out in the details. I think probably what we see is that those international partnerships in AI research tend to focus on softer areas such as climate and health, which are still like obviously extremely useful, and at least that's one area where countries still, so to speak, agree to collaborate and share knowledge. And the same applies for sort of EU-China cooperation, which is currently a bit in the weeds, but still is very much present in things like climate and health. And but at the same time, let's see if the EU and the US sort of do their own thing and then share the results with the Global South, or to what extent they involve partners from the Global South into their project, which would probably have a more and better effect in terms of capacity building in the Global South, and also building on the capacities that already exist there, rather than just like doing things and then sharing them, which is another way of being inclusive.
No, thanks. I think there's varying degrees of engaging, and when one engages and where, and yeah, which way. So it's true, and it's important to consider what, especially if we're thinking about the frameworks and how those are being constructed and what they want to impact, I think. No, so thank you everybody for those comments. I'd like to follow up with a question for Edwin. We're interested in the idea that publishing is not as important indicator of real science in the context when compared to other countries. You mentioned previously the USA. Could you expand on this? Because publishing has been, I think in a way, used to exclude other types of communities and scientists.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that in a setting like my own region, Central America, where the amount of monetary resources for research is so limited, scientists are forced to make sure that their science is as applicable as possible, as applied as possible. And so a measurement of success for our scientific project is not necessarily the paper that you publish in a journal, which is usually international journal written in English. So if I publish my research in an international journal written in English, most likely very few people in my region will not have access to pay for the article or have access to read the article because they don't speak English. And so the level of success of my research would be mainly measured by how well I communicate this information to local decision makers. And so rather than measuring the success in terms of publishing in top ranked journals, the success would be measured in other ways, in terms of, for example, communication instruments for the general public, or how well this information was disseminated in local media, for example, and ideally how well this information reached to decision makers in the political arena. That is definitely a difficult one. No, every scientist's dream is to have a politician listening to you and understanding what you're saying, and at least getting some of the ideas into their own agenda. But so all of these issues of how the knowledge is being distributed to other stakeholders, not only within the scientific community, are definitely much more important than just having the scientific publication in an international journal completed. And that is because science has to be as applicable as possible, like I said before, basically because we do so little science that science has to be useful as possible in the immediate future. Thank you.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that, like, it'd be great to have scientists have an ear for the policymaker as their best friend and tell them everything they need to know about X topic. And I also might want to bring up the point that you talked about the impact. The impact in a regional setting is more important for scientific impact, not this global measure impact. And I think that's what's interesting here is that this is one of the conversations that was had in the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. Is a shift away from impact factors to local impact and how much of an influence you have within the region of your research, how much change you can make.
But if I may, Brian, just listening to you, I'm thinking that one drawback of the system that I just described, where the focus is on local impact, is that, like I mentioned before, there's not so much emphasis on publishing internationally. And as a result, in the global scientific arena, some regions become invisible because there is not that many publications in international journals coming from there. And so that's very evident, again, in the climate change arena, in assessments like the ones that IPCC produce, for example. Those assessments are based on published literature. And so regions like Central America, which are highly vulnerable to climate change, are not well portrayed in those assessments, basically because we don't have enough scientific literature coming from our region. So there is a drawback in just focusing on the local, because we also need to realize that we are part of this global network. And it would be ideal to have both, the best of both worlds, not to have better connections with local stakeholders, but also be able to participate in this global arena of science knowledge and sharing.
Valid point. It's a very good point you made. The next question is going to be directed to Max. Interested in your views on how research participants are excluded in reporting, partly due to ethics and, then, for example, anonymity. Scientists tell stories in their own languages and within their own paradigms. Somehow the participants are, yeah. But you have any comments and thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think that it's one of those, one of those, I guess, hard to find the right balance sometimes. If you're trying to stay as anonymous as possible, then also it's going to be hard probably to make sure that the people involved in some of these studies, I guess, are properly contacted as the results come out. I know that, yeah, in the U.S., for instance, I've gotten many calls around, essentially like a randomized phone survey, for instance, that will be on universal healthcare, for instance, and I think those results then do populate studies that would come into the government. polling again in the US is like an easy example. There's entire websites, that are built on top of keeping track of polling statistics. But when those polls are published, I don't think any of the people polled are tagged on those things. I don't know if there's an incredibly direct answer. There could be more sophisticated ways in thinking about secure ways of like essentially like encrypting phone numbers and having like a separate database where possibly there's like a separate key that could then decrypt those original phone numbers and let people know when somehow contacted after the study was out. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly. I'd have to give some thought on it.
Okay, thanks a lot. And there's another question that came in our Q&A from a research coordinator from the computing department at a Canadian university. And they've had industry partners request such industry days to support research collaborations. And when these were completed, they were deemed also not successful in the eyes of the industry contacts. And they're wondering if you have suggestions on how to make these types of industry academia research collaborations more successful. And if it isn't that, so if it's varied research, so I'll leave it there, sorry.
Not to keep jumping in, I guess this is slightly related to some of the stuff we were talking about before. That's it's good to at least hear that those types of events are happening, and kudos for being involved in one. That's fantastic. I think in some sense, it's probably not surprising that since this, I think again, it's probably not the type of event which has been really hyper optimized yet. So my guess is that when more academia industry interactions are first being tried, it's going to be much more like an experiment than a well-oiled machine. And I think, again, if those things are not working yet, that just means probably, again, there's sort of a shared language developing for what's useful and what's a useful way for both of those groups to feel like they're legitimately learning and connecting with each other. And I could see it being very easy to miss the mark in making those connections work. Again, I would say it wouldn't be surprising to me at all if the SINs are a little bit more in the private industry, where it is good in theory to want to stay connected to people, but then when your job could be on the line, unless you're making sure your company is hitting certain revenue targets, I can see how anything outside of that becomes kind of second tier. And so you go back to focusing on what keeps your job and stability and so forth. So I think that at the same time, I'm very confident that there must be some kind of solutions for conferences that might not be as hyper industry specific, but maybe more topical, or maybe again have different plans or structures in place such that there's actually a reason for there to be a reoccurring connection with some of the people involved. And my guess again is that there's just a wide green space of ways to experiment with those types of collaborations that we really haven't probably devoted tons of energy into seeing what really works well yet. So I would not yet take it at all as a negative, as much as you probably were a little bit on the forefront of seeing what these types of new interactions could look like. And we're probably not going to, as a society, get it right the first time. So my guess is that it's a good idea, but would need more refinement. And again, probably always comes back to there being some incentives where there's real reasons that both more people from the research space as well as the private space want to keep coming back to the table to participate in those events.
If I may add, from my own previous experience as a professor at a university here in Guatemala, I think that it's a matter of lining up interest and research questions, and oftentimes industry will come with a very specific question or a problem that they need to have solved, and usually researchers may work in the same area but not in that specific question, and so it might take some adjusting for researchers to adapt to that question. And it also takes some adaptation in terms of the timing, because oftentimes industry will need very quick questions, quick meaning within weeks or months, whereas academia and research is usually thought of in terms of years, And so the timing is for sure another factor that needs to be adjusted when we want to increase this collaboration between industry and academia. And I think there has to be learning from both sides, learning from the academia, how the industry works and what their needs are, and vice versa.
And Alice, I don't know if you or Miho, if you want to comment. Otherwise, I would shift to another question. Remaining closing thoughts on that, on the private sector and industry and academia collaborations? No? Okay. All right. Moving on to the next question. And this might be the last question before we wrap up. And I want to combine a couple questions here to link in the section on civil society. There was a comment made about the role of we cannot forget about civil society here as well. And I was wondering what are your thoughts of bringing them in and also expanding on the idea of getting them involved into these global and or local solutions. So any thoughts on how to bring in civil society to this broader conversation of open science?
Well, I think that
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No,
go ahead.
I was going to say that I agree completely that civil society is a key player, and to a higher or lower extent, governments do respond to civil society. Depends on how well oiled your democracy is. Politicians do answer to the pressure from civil society, and so the more we empower civil society with knowledge and capacity to understand what the issues are, the more tools they would have to demand response from their government. And so it is in a way a matter of capacity building of the general public, because oftentimes many of these issues are really not that evident to the general public, to the everyday person on the street. So it is a matter of how much we can inform the general public of what the issues are and what the possible benefits and problems are around all these technologies that we have been discussing. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I've talked too much already. Please.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Miho.
Yeah, just a small comment. I think citizen science is now quite common in climate change research, and many of government, for example, France is very famous for having the opinion from inviting all citizens. It's very directly, and then the president, even president, collecting their opinion and reflecting on the strategies and the policy-making processes. That is really great things and a very open science for everyone involved for policy-making processes. That is really important. And also digital communication is very affordable for taking and inviting for all people in this platform. That is my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short. The only thing I was going to say is I think one of the biggest, I guess, impediments to good involvement of the civil sector is trying to actually have that group of people feel like they trust and understand the responses they're getting from the scientific community. And I think that is a challenging problem in a world that's filled with technology that has essentially brought the cost of spreading lies down to zero. So there's a deluge of misinformation and even again, some very trusted organizations have sometimes come off, I think, in to the general public as not clear or possibly like mixed messages. And so I think what we can do collectively as a society to help bring the civil side is make sure that there's like ground truth, scientific communications that are very clear, that don't try to avoid flip-flopping as much as possible, are very probably conservative in only spreading information that they basically think is near 100% true, that won't have to change. That's hard, but I think like that's probably going to be one of the biggest challenges in getting sort of the watchdogs we need involved, is that they need to make sure they're actually well informed and not, you know, being fed things which could obfuscate or straight up sort of be lies. So yeah, I think that's part of it too.
In other words, what I'm hearing is like twisting the narrative for their own gain. I think that's I know there's a lot more questions that I see in comments that I would love to address. But I think in the interest of time and for everyone here, I think we'll have to slowly start bringing this down to a close. Before I jump into the closing portion of it, one question I want to ask everyone here in terms of their thoughts is, I know earlier I asked the question about what do they think open science means, and I had some selections for you. I kind of want to do this again to see whether or not you still feel the same way before we had open access, but I want to see if this view has changed. So I think the poll is open for everyone to interact and add. If any people have changed their minds or view it differently, I think you can select multiple. So I'd love to see your thoughts. Thank you for playing with us with this poll. I love the interaction that's going on. And your comments, we're definitely going to take them into account in the chat. So a couple of the points that we made earlier in the very beginning of this session today is that we are planning on bringing all the thoughts and ideas to a white paper to be brought up to the UN General Assembly on how open science is needed and how to make equitable partnerships, and thinking about those more humanistic sides of it and the relationships that we need to build to counter the technological rise of new inventions. Now that I have talked about for a minute, I'm going to share the results with you. What's interesting here is that we see that most of the responses were centered around open access. Now it's kind of relatively even in terms of open data, open resources, and open source. I think that's a fascinating change in this discussion today, and that's definitely changed people's perspectives. On that note, I would like to thank everyone here for joining today. And thank you to our panelists for being active with us for 2 hours long. It is not easy thinking at this level for a long time. And to our audiences, thank you so much for being engaged with us, even dealing with my little quote unquote games and activities. Really appreciate it. Hope this has been helpful to you all in building more equitable partnerships to make open science more accessible for all. And thank you so much.